The world sees first-class seats and luxury flights as a privilege, reserved for the elite. But what happens when privilege is weaponized? When wealth and power decide who belongs and who doesn't? Meet Sutton Gaines, an elite FBI special agent, a relentless investigator, and a black woman who knows exactly what it feels like to step into spaces where people like her are silently questioned, subtly dismissed, or outright challenged. She's not just fighting criminals. She's fighting a system built to protect the powerful at all costs. This isn't just a story about a stolen first-class seat. It's about corruption at the highest levels, an airline that's more than just a business, and a criminal empire hiding in plain sight. When a simple flight turns into a battlefield of lies, privilege, and justice, Sutton is about to prove that some people don't just survive the game, they change the rules. Are you ready for twists, betrayals, and a conspiracy that reaches far beyond the clouds? Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And tell us, what would you do if you were in Sutton's seat? Let's talk justice. Sutton Gaines adjusted the strap of her leather handbag as she walked down the pristine, carpeted aisle of Flight 227. She had booked a first-class ticket weeks ago, knowing she would need this brief moment of peace after a grueling business trip in New York. A high-profile mergers consultant, she was used to the cutthroat negotiations, the long hours, and the endless travel. But tonight, she wanted nothing more than to sink into her seat, sip a glass of wine, and close her eyes until the plane touched down in Los Angeles. She had learned long ago that her presence in these luxury spaces did not always go unquestioned. The raised brows, the subtle double takes, the quick glances exchanged between staff, it was all too familiar. But Sutton had perfected the art of indifference. She had worked hard for her success. She belonged here just as much as anyone else. As she approached seat 3A, she slowed. A man was already sitting there. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, his tailored navy suit crisp, exuding the kind of wealth that didn't require logos or brand names. He held a crystal tumbler of whiskey in one hand and a Wall Street Journal in the other, flipping the page leisurely, as if he owned not just the seat, but the entire plane. Sutton frowned and double-checked her boarding pass. Seat 3A. She hadn't made a mistake. She cleared her throat lightly. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." The man didn't look up right away. He took a slow sip of his drink, savoring it, before setting the glass down. Then, finally, he lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes flickered with mild amusement, as if this interaction was nothing more than a brief inconvenience. "You're mistaken," he said smoothly. "This is my seat." Sutton kept her expression neutral. "I don't think so. My boarding pass says 3A. She held it up, letting the overhead lighting catch the bold lettering. The man exhaled, clearly uninterested in arguing. He glanced toward the front of the cabin and snapped his fingers once. A flight attendant in a perfectly pressed uniform appeared at his side almost instantly. Maribel Henshaw, according to her name tag. Her smile was polished, but did not reach her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Lowell," she said, tilting her head in mild concern. "There seems to be some confusion," the man, Whitaker Lowell, said lazily. "This young woman believes she has a claim to my seat." Maribel's eyes flickered toward Sutton. The polite professionalism in her face cooled ever so slightly. "Let me check the system," she said, her voice honeyed but firm. She pulled out a sleek tablet, tapped a few buttons, and then nodded. "Actually, Ms. Gaines," she said, looking up with that same controlled smile, "it appears there's been a reassignment. Your seat was changed." Sutton's posture stiffened. "Changed? By whom?" Maribel hesitated just a beat too long. "It happens sometimes with system updates. But don't worry, we have a lovely seat available for you in premium economy." The words hit like a slap. Sutton inhaled slowly, holding back the simmering irritation rising in her chest. "I didn't ask for a reassignment. I booked this seat weeks ago." "I understand," Maribel said, still maintaining that infuriatingly calm tone. "But first class is reserved for our most valued customers. Sometimes, last-minute accommodations need to be made." Sutton's jaw tightened. She understood exactly what was happening. She had seen it before. Whitaker Lowell had wanted the seat. And the airline, whether out of deference to his wealth or his influence, had simply given it to him. Whitaker smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It's nothing personal," he drawled. "I'm sure you'll be comfortable in economy." Sutton refused to let her irritation show. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "I'd like to speak to your flight supervisor." Maribel's smile twitched, but she nodded. "Of course. Give me a moment." As the flight attendant walked toward the front of the cabin, Whitaker sighed dramatically. "Is all this really necessary?" he asked. "It's just a seat." Sutton arched a brow. "Then why don't you take the one in premium economy?" Whitaker let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Come on. Let's not pretend like we don't both know how this works." Before Sutton could respond, a voice spoke up from a few rows back. "She has every right to be here." Sutton turned to see an older black man, dressed in a sharp but understated suit, watching the exchange with keen interest. Orson Graves. She didn't know him, but there was something about his presence that felt deliberate, like he had been expecting this to happen. Maribel returned with another man, this one in a navy blue uniform, Colin Weiss, the flight supervisor. "Is there a problem?" he asked, though his gaze was already flickering toward Whitaker Lowell with barely veiled deference. Sutton met Colin's eyes head on. "I want to know exactly why my seat was reassigned without my consent." A tense silence hung in the air. Whitaker Lowell leaned back in his seat, sipping his whiskey, watching it all unfold like a spectator enjoying a private show. Sutton crossed her arms, maintaining her composure. Colin Weiss, the flight supervisor, studied her for a brief moment before turning toward Maribel. "What's the issue here?" Maribel's expression remained smooth. "There's been a reassignment. Ms. Gaines was moved to premium economy." Sutton interjected, her voice measured but firm. "I didn't authorize any reassignment." Colin exhaled through his nose, his patience clearly thinning. "Let me check the system." He pulled out a sleek tablet, swiped a few times, and frowned slightly. "According to the system, Seat 3A was reassigned this morning." Sutton narrowed her eyes. "By whom?" Colin hesitated. "It doesn't say." Whitaker let out a quiet chuckle, swirling his whiskey. "I wouldn't worry too much about it, Ms. Gaines. They've offered you a perfectly fine seat. No need to make a fuss." Sutton turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "I paid for first class, just like you did." Whitaker smirked. "Yes, but some of us have a little more influence than others." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers discreetly observed the exchange, while others pretended not to listen. Orson Graves remained still, his gaze shifting between Sutton and Whitaker, as if filing away every detail. Sutton wasn't naive. She understood how these situations usually played out. Whitaker had likely pulled some strings, made a call, or thrown around his last name. And just like that, the airline had bent to his will. But Sutton wasn't going to let it slide. She glanced at Colin. "If this was a reassignment, show me the record of the request." Colin shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said, the system doesn't specify. Then put me back in my original seat." A beat of silence. Maribel folded her hands in front of her. "Ms. Gaines, first-class seating is limited. At this point, it would be a hassle to undo the change." Whitaker sighed, as if he were growing tired of the conversation. "If this is about proving a point, you've made it. Now, let the adults enjoy their flight." Sutton's fingers curled slightly, but her expression remained cool. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Lowell. If the situation were reversed, would you be so willing to just let it go?" Whitaker's smirk faltered for half a second before returning. The situation wouldn't be reversed. And there it was, the truth masked in arrogance. Colin cleared his throat. "Ms. Gaines, I understand your frustration. But as of right now, we don't have another available seat in first class." "You mean you don't have another seat for me?" Sutton corrected. Maribel's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not what we're saying." Whitaker took another sip of his drink, satisfied with how things were unfolding. Sutton took a breath, her mind working quickly. "Fine," she said smoothly. "Then I'll need this in writing. A confirmation that my seat was reassigned without my consent, along with the name of the person who authorized it." Maribel blinked. Excuse me? If this was a legitimate reassignment, there shouldn't be a problem documenting it, Sutton said, tilting her head. Colin hesitated. I don't think that's necessary. Sutton pulled out her phone and opened the airline's customer relations page. It's just that I have a meeting with a few Skyward Airlines executives next week, and I'd love to discuss how their first-class system works. She tapped the screen as if composing an email. Should I see your name, Colin? Colin stiffened. Whitaker's smirk disappeared. Maribel's expression turned unreadable. Orson, still seated nearby, let out a quiet chuckle. MS. Gaines, Colin said carefully. Perhaps we can find a solution here. Sutton arched a brow. I'm listening. Maribel and Colin exchanged glances. Finally, Colin sighed. I'll see what I can do. Whitaker scowled. Are you serious? Colin ignored him, stepping toward the front of the cabin to make a call. Maribel, clearly unhappy, gave Sutton a tight-lipped smile. Would you like a drink while you wait? I'd love a glass of white wine, Sutton said pleasantly. Whitaker muttered something under his breath and downed the rest of his whiskey. Orson leaned back in his seat, shaking his head with amusement. Sutton took a slow breath, knowing the game was far from over. Colin returned a few minutes later, his expression tight. Ms. Gaines, I checked with our system. It appears there was an internal override on your seat assignment, but the request was manually processed, meaning there's no digital record of who made the change. He sighed. That's unusual. Sutton crossed her arms. So what you're saying is someone deliberately removed me from my seat without documentation. Colin hesitated. I can't confirm that. Whitaker scoffed, setting his empty whiskey glass down with a sharp clink. Oh, for God's sake. This is ridiculous. Give the woman a voucher or something and send her on her way. Sutton didn't take the bait. I'm staying in first class, she said simply. Whitaker let out a quiet laugh. You're really going to make a scene over this? Sutton turned toward him. Why do you assume I'm making a scene? Because I won't let you take something that doesn't belong to you. Whitaker's smirk barely wavered. It's just a seat, sweetheart. Nothing to get all worked up about. Sutton held his gaze. Then why don't you give it up? The air in the cabin thickened. A few passengers glanced over, pretending not to listen too closely. A woman seated across the aisle, a Lowen Sutter, judging by her nameplate from some corporate event, sighed loudly, shaking her head. Some people always think they deserve more than they really do. Sutton didn't acknowledge her. She was used to people like a Lowen, used to the condescension wrapped in civility. Orson Graves, the older black man who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward slightly. His expression was unreadable, but there was something calculating in his eyes. He was watching everything, absorbing every detail. Colin pinched the bridge of his nose. MS. Gaines, I'd like to speak with the captain, Sutton said. Maribel stiffened. There's no need for that. If my seat was reassigned without my consent, and no one can explain why, then yes, there is a need. Colin shifted uncomfortably. The captain is preparing for takeoff. I can assure you he won't be able to intervene in a seating dispute. Then I'll wait. Sutton sat down in the empty aisle seat across from Whitaker, making it clear she wasn't moving. Whitaker exhaled sharply, looking at Colin as if expecting him to handle it. The Lowen made a small, disapproving noise and turned back to her magazine. Maribel's smile thinned. Ms. Gaines, refusing to comply with crew instructions can be grounds for removal from a flight. Sutton tilted her head. I was instructed to accept a reassignment that has no legitimate record, in favor of a passenger who has yet to provide any proof that this seat was his to begin with. And now I'm the one who's a problem. Whitaker chuckled, shaking his head. You must be exhausting to work with. Orson let out a quiet, amused breath. Actually, I think she's quite effective. Whitaker's smirk disappeared. Maribel folded her hands in front of her. Ms. Gaines, I strongly suggest you cooperate. Sutton glanced around the cabin. Let me ask you something, she said, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. If I were a white man in a three-piece suit, would any of this be happening right now? A hush fell over the space. Colin's jaw tightened. Maribel looked away. Whitaker's lips curved into something cold. The low and shifted uncomfortably. Sutton turned back to Colin. "I'll wait for the captain." A muscle in his cheek twitched. Maribel looked toward Colin, silently asking what to do. Whitaker exhaled through his nose. Unbelievable. The tension in the cabin thickened as Sutton remained seated, unwavering. Colin whispered something to Maribel, who nodded and turned toward the front of the plane. A few moments later, another flight attendant entered. Yora Callahan, a senior crew member with a more serious demeanor. His sharp eyes took in the situation quickly. "Ms. Gaines," Yora said, his tone professional, but noticeably more respectful than Maribel's. "I was informed there's a dispute over your seating assignment." Sutton didn't break eye contact. "Not a dispute. A theft." Yora's expression remained neutral, but she noticed the flicker of interest in his gaze. "Would you mind stepping to the galley with me so we can discuss this privately?" Whitaker exhaled dramatically. Finally, some common sense. Sutton ignored him. "No," she said simply. "I'd rather stay right here." Yora hesitated. "Ms. Gaines, you know this is wrong," Sutton said, her voice lower now. "If you check the system, you'd see I was manually removed from this seat. And if you check deeper, you'll see this isn't the first time something like this has happened on this airline, is it?" Yora's lips pressed into a firm line. He didn't confirm or deny anything. That was all the confirmation she needed. Sutton reached into her blazer, pulling out her wallet. She flipped it open and placed it on the tray table in front of her. A small leather-bound credential case sat there, gleaming under the cabin lights. The air in the cabin shifted instantly. Maribel visibly paled. Colin stiffened. Whitaker, for the first time, looked genuinely caught off guard. Yora inhaled sharply. Yes." Sutton closed the case with a quiet snap. "Special Agent Sutton Gaines, Organized Crime and Corruption Task Force." She looked up at Yora, then Colin, then let her gaze settle on Whitaker. "And I'm not here by coincidence." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Orson Graves chuckled. Sutton's eyes flicked to him. "Something funny?" Orson leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "I had a feeling you weren't just a consultant." He crossed his arms, looking amused. "The way you held your ground. The way you watch people." He smiled faintly. "Took me a minute, but I see it now." Whitaker's voice cut through the moment, his shock quickly morphing into anger. "This is absurd. What exactly are you implying, Agent Gaines?" Sutton leaned forward slightly. "I'm implying that I'm investigating a criminal operation. And this flight, this airline, is part of it." Maribel took an unconscious step back. Colin swallowed hard. Whitaker scoffed. "You can't be serious." Sutton arched a brow. "Would you like to hear the charges?" Whitaker didn't respond. Yora's voice was quiet but firm. "What are you investigating?" Sutton exhaled, resting her hands on the armrests. Skyward Airlines has been flagged multiple times in federal investigations for fraud, money laundering, and internal misconduct. Specifically, preferential treatment for wealthy clientele in exchange for illegal favors. She turned toward Whitaker. "People like you, Mr. Lowell." Whitaker laughed, but it was forced. "That's insane." Sutton remained calm. "I assume you've taken this flight before. First class, priority boarding, exclusive perks. But you've never paid for them, have you?" Whitaker's smirk returned. "That's called status, sweetheart. When you're a platinum executive member, you get certain privileges." Sutton tilted her head. "Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the fact that your name is tied to several corporate fraud cases, all conveniently overlooked because of your influence." Whitaker's nostrils flared. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sutton smiled. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And I know that you don't just get free upgrades because of status. You get them because you're connected to people inside the airline, people who make sure you always get what you want." Whitaker's hands curled into fists. Yora glanced toward Colin. "Is this true?" Colin hesitated. I don't know." Sutton let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "But it's not just you, is it, Whitaker?" Her gaze flicked to Maribel. "How much do they pay you to keep quiet?" Colin turned to her. "Maribel." Whitaker spoke before she could. This is outrageous. You think flashing a badge means you can accuse people of whatever you want. Sutton's gaze remained steady. No, but the evidence I have does. Whitaker's breathing was heavy. The first beads of sweat formed on his brow. Sutton folded her hands. You've been on my radar for months, Whitaker. Your company, your connections, and now this flight. She leaned in slightly. Did you really think I was here by accident? Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. Then Orson spoke again, his voice light but laced with meaning. This is where it gets interesting. Sutton turned toward him. Care to elaborate? Orson smiled faintly. You're right. Whitaker isn't the only one with ties to this operation. He glanced toward Maribel. And neither is she. Sutton's pulse quickened. Go on. Orson laced his fingers together. Let's just say you're only scratching the surface. Sutton studied him, measuring his words. He knew more than he was letting on. Whitaker snapped. Orson, don't. Sutton narrowed her eyes, studying Orson's expression. There was no fear, no hesitation, just an air of quiet amusement, as if he had been waiting for this moment. She turned back to Whitaker, who was no longer smirking. His jaw was set, his fists clenched, and his breathing a fraction too quick. His carefully cultivated arrogance had cracked. Sutton leaned in slightly, her voice calm but pointed. Seems like your friend here knows more than you'd like. Whitaker exhaled sharply, his gaze flickering toward Orson, irritation creeping into his features. Shut your mouth, Graves. Orson chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, Whitaker, you always did underestimate people. Yura shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Maribel's shoulders tensed, her grip tightening around the edge of the drink cart. Colin looked completely out of his depth, his eyes darting to Sutton, as if silently asking what the hell was happening. Sutton didn't give him an answer. She was focused on Orson. You worked for him, didn't you? Orson exhaled, his amusement fading slightly. Worked with him, he corrected. For a time. Whitaker's knuckles turned white against the armrest. You're lying. Orson barely spared him a glance. Please. If you were as smart as you think you are, you would have seen this coming. Sutton absorbed that, filing it away for later. What kind of work? Orson tilted his head, assessing her. You already have a theory, don't you? Sutton held his gaze. I have more than that. Whitaker let out a sharp breath, his composure slipping further. This is ridiculous. We're on a damn airplane, not an interrogation room. Sutton ignored him. Humor me, she said to Orson. I want to hear it from you. Orson tapped his fingers against his knee, considering. Fine. But you already know the basics. Skyward Airlines has been moving more than just passengers. The air around them grew heavier. Sutton didn't blink. Go on. Orson's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though there was no warmth in it. Freight shipments, private cargo, special accommodations for high-value clients. His gaze flicked toward Whitaker. You see, Whit here has always been good at pretending he's important. But the truth? He's just a middleman, a well-dressed errand boy with delusions of grandeur. Whitaker shot up from his seat, so fast his empty whiskey glass tipped over. That's enough. His voice was raw, his usual condescension replaced with something dangerously close to panic. Maribel flinched, her expression briefly betraying fear before she masked it again. Colin stepped forward, instinctively trying to de-escalate. Mr. Lowell, please. Whitaker ignored him, rounding on Orson with barely contained fury. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to shut up now. Orson didn't look fazed. Or what? He asked mildly. You'll have me removed from the flight? Because I think we both know how that would end. Sutton caught the subtext immediately. Orson knew too much, and Whitaker knew it. This wasn't just about corporate fraud. It was something deeper, something darker. Human trafficking, Sutton said, letting the words settle. Maribel sucked in a sharp breath. Colin paled. Yora's entire posture shifted, his stance subtly adjusting, like a man suddenly realizing the ground beneath him was far more unstable than he thought. Whitaker's head snapped toward Sutton, his face a shade paler. You're out of your damn mind. Sutton stayed calm. Am I? She tilted her head. Skyward's been flagged before. Suspicious flight manifests. Unregistered cargo. First-class passengers with unusual travel patterns. She nodded toward Orson. And now we have confirmation from someone who was on the inside. Orson exhaled, rubbing his temple. Not willingly. Whitaker took a step closer, voice low and furious. You have no idea what you're talking about. Sutton didn't move. Then, explain it to me. Whitaker's mouth pressed into a thin line. Sutton let the silence stretch. Orson, she said without looking away from Whitaker. What happened when you tried to leave? Orson smiled, but there was no humor in it. Let's just say they don't take resignations very well. Sutton absorbed that. And you think Whitaker was involved in that? Orson's expression darkened. I know he was. Whitaker shook his head. You're a damn liar. Orson leaned forward, voice lower now. Then why are you sweating, Whit? The first bead of sweat slid down Whitaker's temple. Maribel looked like she wanted to disappear. Colin stood frozen, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation. Yora, however, was watching closely, his mind clearly working through the implications. Sutton knew this was the moment. The cracks were deepening. The truth was slipping through. She needed to push harder. Who's pulling the strings? She asked Orson. He hesitated. Whitaker took the opportunity to cut in. This is over. He turned toward Colin. I want her off this flight. Now. Colin hesitated. I can't do that. Whitaker's nostrils flared. You damn well can. He gestured toward Sutton. She's disturbing passengers, impersonating law enforcement, making baseless accusations. He stopped when Sutton casually flipped her badge open again. Impersonating, she repeated. You sure you want to go with that? Whitaker's mouth snapped shut. Orson let out another amused breath. Sutton turned back to Orson. Names, she said. Orson held her gaze for a long moment. Then finally he exhaled. Cahill Industries. The name sent a ripple through the space. Whitaker's entire body went rigid. Sutton's pulse kicked up. Cahill Industries was big. Maribel let out a tiny, involuntary sound before slapping a hand over her mouth. Yora's eyes sharpened. Colin looked completely out of his depth. Whitaker took a slow step back. You just killed yourself, Graves. Orson's expression didn't change. Maybe, but I'm not going alone. The plane suddenly lurched, a brief but noticeable turbulence rolling through the cabin. Sutton steadied herself. This was getting bigger by the second. Sutton absorbed the weight of Orson's words. Cahill Industries. The name alone carried power, influence, and a reputation built on decades of quiet corruption. If they were involved, this went far beyond Whitaker Lowell. It explained the systemic nature of the operation, the ability to manipulate corporate systems, even the casual impunity with which Whitaker acted. He wasn't the mastermind. He was just another piece on the board. Sutton needed to move quickly, but as she reached for her phone, the plane suddenly lurched again. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical delay. We'll be holding at the gate for a few extra minutes as we run routine checks. Thank you for your patience. Sutton's grip tightened around her phone. Routine checks? That wasn't a coincidence. Whitaker had called someone. He was stalling. She turned toward him just as he lowered his own phone, slipping it back into his pocket with a smirk. Something wrong, Agent Gaines? He asked, his voice mockingly polite. Seems like we won't be taking off just yet. Sutton's mind raced. She needed to get word to her field office before Whitaker's people could contain the situation. She opened her encrypted messaging app, typing rapidly. Cahill Industries confirmed. Suspect on board. Possible airline collusion. Need immediate response. Before she could hit send, a shadow loomed over her. Ms. Gaines, a voice said firmly. She looked up. Marcus Fielding, a second flight attendant, one she hadn't interacted with yet, stood there, his expression blank, but his stance authoritative. He was tall, well-built, with the posture of someone used to command. I'm going to have to ask you to put your phone away. Sutton arched a brow. Why? Marcus didn't blink. FAA regulations prohibit the use of personal communication devices during flight delays. That was a lie. Sutton knew the rules. Phones had to be in airplane mode, but no regulation prohibited text-based communication on the ground. "You just made that up," she said calmly. Marcus's expression didn't change. "Please comply, Ms. Gaines." Sutton didn't move. This was orchestrated. Whitaker had someone in the crew working for him. Maybe multiple people. If she didn't play this right, they'd try to isolate her, remove her from a flight, or worse. A few passengers were watching now, sensing the confrontation. Orson remained silent, observing. Whitaker leaned back in his seat, looking far too pleased with himself. Sutton made a show of exhaling through her nose, appearing mildly frustrated but compliant. She turned her phone face down on her tray table. "Fine." Marcus nodded, but his eyes lingered on her a fraction too long. He was waiting for something. Maribel Henshaw reappeared at Marcus's side, her face a mask of professionalism, but her eyes sharp. "Ms. Gaines," she said smoothly, "we need to speak with you in private." Sutton tilted her head. "About what?" Maribel glanced at Marcus, then back at Sutton. "We've received a report that you've been exhibiting aggressive behavior toward other passengers and flight crew." The sheer audacity of it nearly made Sutton laugh. "Aggressive?" Marcus nodded, crossing his arms. "There's concern that you may be a risk to the safety of the flight." Whitaker was grinning now. The pieces clicked into place. This was the setup. Sutton leaned back slightly, keeping her voice level. "Who made this report?" Maribel hesitated for half a second too long. "We're not at liberty to disclose that." Sutton smirked. "Because it's fabricated." Marcus's jaw tightened. "We need you to come with us, now." "Under what authority?" Marcus exhaled sharply. "Failure to comply with flight crew instructions is a federal offense." There it was. They were setting up grounds for removal. If she resisted, they'd escalate. If she complied, they'd get her off the plane and out of the equation. Either way, Whitaker won. Orson finally spoke, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Seems a little convenient, doesn't it?" Marcus's eyes flickered toward him. "Excuse me?" Orson gestured lazily toward Sutton. "She's been sitting here the entire time. She hasn't threatened anyone. Haven't seen her raise her voice. But suddenly, right when things aren't going your boss's way, she's a danger to the flight?" He leaned back. "That's sloppy." A few passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked at Whitaker, then at Sutton, realizing for the first time that something deeper was happening. Marcus's expression darkened. "This doesn't concern you, sir." Orson smiled slightly. "Oh, but it does. Because if you remove her under false pretenses, you're not just interfering with a federal agent." He let the words sink in. "You're obstructing an ongoing investigation." Whitaker's smile thinned. "He's bluffing," he muttered. Sutton saw her opening. She picked up her phone again, this time holding it up for Marcus to see. "I'm going to call my field office now. If you're telling the truth, they'll confirm that there's a valid security reason to remove me." She tilted her head. "Unless you'd like to stop obstructing justice?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Maribel shifted, suddenly looking far less sure of herself. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have completed our final checks and will be departing shortly. Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to win this one. Sutton lowered her phone, but didn't put it away. "I'd like to return to my seat now." Maribel stepped back first. Marcus hesitated, then followed. The plane had barely leveled off when Sutton sensed the shift. The tension that had momentarily eased during takeoff returned with sharp precision. The flight attendants avoided her gaze. Marcus and Maribel whispered in the galley, their glances flicking toward her before quickly looking away. Whitaker, seated across the aisle, drummed his fingers against the armrest, his smirk more confident than before. Sutton knew that look. He wasn't worried anymore. Something was about to happen. Sure enough, just as the fastened seatbelt sign dimmed, Marcus reappeared, this time with 2 air marshals in tow. The men were dressed in civilian clothes, but their presence was unmistakable. The taller one, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair, addressed her directly. "Ms. Gaines, we need you to come with us." Sutton didn't move. "On what grounds?" The shorter marshal, a wiry man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "We've received multiple complaints about your behavior. The captain has authorized your removal at the next available landing point." Sutton's grip on the armrest tightened slightly, but her face remained neutral. "Let me guess. No one here can name a single passenger who made those complaints." The taller marshal's gaze flickered, betraying the slightest hesitation. The shorter one was smoother. "That information isn't relevant. You are required to comply." Whitaker exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. "See? Actions have consequences." Orson chuckled from his seat. "Yeah, funny how the consequences always seem to go one way." A few rows ahead, a young woman with a hoodie and earbuds glanced over, subtly angling her phone. Sutton didn't miss the small red recording light in the reflection of the window. Someone was filming. Good. She turned her attention back to the marshals. "You both know this is illegal." The taller one's jaw tensed. "Ms. Gaines, you're interfering with an active federal investigation. Removing me without cause is obstruction of justice." She gestured toward her badge, which was still visible in her lap. "Unless, of course, you're both willing to sign off on a formal report stating you knowingly assisted in the unlawful detainment of a federal agent." The shorter marshal hesitated. The taller one's eyes flicked toward Marcus, then toward Whitaker. "We're following orders." The young woman recording cleared her throat loudly, shifting in her seat. "I don't know about anyone else, but I'd love to see how this plays out in court," she said casually. "Or on the news." Marcus shot her a glare. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." She smirked. "That's the thing about the internet. It concerns everyone." Whitaker's expression darkened. He sat up straighter, his eyes darting toward the marshals. He hadn't planned for this. Sutton almost smiled. Orson leaned forward slightly. "I'd think real carefully about your next move, gentlemen." His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. "Because if she's removed from this plane, I'll make a few calls myself. And trust me, you'll want to hear what I have to say." Whitaker's entire posture changed. Orson didn't look at him. He just smiled at Sutton. The marshals exchanged glances. The taller one exhaled sharply and turned toward Marcus. "If this is a legitimate security concern, we'll handle it. Otherwise, this is a civil dispute, and we have no jurisdiction to remove a federal agent without direct cause." The tension in the cabin reached its breaking point. The marshals hesitated, the passengers watched, and Whitaker, for the first time, looked genuinely unsure of his next move. Then, the intercom crackled. "This is Captain Holloway speaking. I understand there's been an incident in first class. I'd like a full report before any further action is taken." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority. "Until then, no passengers are to be removed from this flight." Marcus clenched his jaw. He had been waiting for the captain's approval, and now that lifeline had just been cut. He turned back to Whitaker, expecting guidance, but Whitaker wasn't paying attention to him anymore. His gaze was locked onto Orson, his fingers tapping against his knee in an uneven rhythm. He was nervous. Sutton had seen men like him before, men who were untouchable for so long that they never anticipated a scenario where their control slipped. Sutton took advantage of the silence. "I'd say this is where you cut your losses, Whitaker," she said, her voice even. "Because right now, the only person escalating the situation is you." Whitaker exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "You think this is over?" Sutton smiled slightly. "No, I think you're out of moves." The young woman, still recording, shifted in her seat. "It's funny," she said casually. "All these first-class passengers. And yet the only one causing a disruption is the guy who started this whole thing." Murmurs spread through the cabin. A few people nodded in agreement. Whitaker's face darkened. Then Sutton's phone buzzed. An incoming message. She glanced down. The sender was anonymous, but the content was damning. A forwarded internal email from Skyward Airlines. The subject line: Passenger reassignment request first-class priority. The body of the email detailed an override in the system, authorizing Whitaker's seat upgrade at the expense of another passenger. It listed the requester, Maribel Henshaw. Sutton's eyes flicked up to Maribel, who had gone rigid. She turned her phone toward Marcus. I'm sure the airline will be thrilled to know that their first-class assignments can be bought and sold like cheap stock options. Whitaker turned to her, his expression venomous. You idiot. Maribel took a shaky step back. I was just following. Whitaker cut her off. Shut up. Marcus exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. It was clear now. He had been played just like everyone else. Orson let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Well, this just keeps getting better. Sutton leaned back in her seat, satisfied. I believe that settles things. Whitaker didn't respond. He just stared at Maribel, his fury barely restrained. Maribel swallowed hard, then did something no one expected. She turned to the marshals. I need to file a report, she said, her voice shaking. I was bribed. She stopped, glancing at Whitaker's burning glare, then quickly looked away. I was coerced into switching Ms. Gaines's seat. A stunned silence filled the cabin. Whitaker's entire body tensed. You absolute. The shorter marshal held up a hand. Enough. Sutton arched a brow. Looks like someone just flipped on you, Whitaker. Silence hung in the air as the realization sank in. Whitaker had lost. Maribel had turned against him. The marshals had backed down, and the passengers were no longer indifferent spectators. The shift was palpable. People were watching. And for a man like Whitaker Lowell, exposure was a greater punishment than any prison sentence. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be returning to the gate before continuing with our scheduled departure. Please remain seated. Whitaker's hands curled into fists. His composure was crumbling. You think this changes anything? He muttered. Sutton didn't react. She didn't need to. The weight of his downfall was pressing in on him from every angle. He turned to Orson, his voice low and furious. You did this. Orson smirked, tilting his head slightly. No, Whit. You did this. I just let it happen. The plane taxied back to the gate. Passengers murmured, some stealing glances at Sutton, others openly recording now. Whitaker's name was already trending. The young woman who had filmed the entire incident was typing rapidly on her phone, her video undoubtedly making its way across the internet. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, law enforcement boarded the plane. 2 uniformed officers and a federal agent in a dark suit strode down the aisle with quiet authority. Mr. Lowell, the agent said, his tone clipped. You're coming with us. Whitaker let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Sutton leaned back in her seat, watching as the officers pulled Whitaker up. He didn't resist, but his glare never left her. You don't get it, do you? He said as they cuffed his wrists. I'm not the villain here. I just know how the game works. Sutton finally spoke. The game's over, Whitaker. He scoffed. For me, maybe. But you think this changes anything? You think Cahill Industries will just roll over? Sutton's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't let him see it. The officers guided Whitaker toward the exit. As he passed Maribel, he sneered. You better pray I never get out. She didn't look at him. She already knew she had signed her own sentence. The moment Whitaker was off the plane, passengers erupted into whispers. Some clapped quietly. The tension in the cabin released like a snapped wire. Sutton exhaled slowly. It was over. As she reached for her phone, another notification flashed across the screen. Live footage from the plane was already viral. The headline, Wealthy CEO tries to remove black woman from first class, gets arrested instead. Sutton sighed. She hadn't planned on becoming a public story, but she knew this video would change things. People would ask questions, and questions led to answers, and answers led to consequences. Orson stood, stretching. Hell of a flight, he mused. Sutton arched a brow. We haven't even taken off yet. He chuckled. True, but I get the feeling this trip just got a lot more interesting for you. The plane sat motionless at the gate, passengers still murmuring as the last of the officers stepped off with Whitaker. The energy in the cabin had changed. Some looked at Sutton with quiet admiration, others with curiosity, but no one, not even Eloan Sutter, dared question whether she belonged in first class anymore. Sutton exhaled, rolling the tension from her shoulders. The hardest part was over, or so she thought. Orson lingered near his seat, arms crossed, a contemplative look on his face. "Hell of a show," he mused. Sutton arched a brow. "You knew this would happen." He shrugged. "Not exactly. But I knew Whitaker was too arrogant to survive a real fight. You just sped up the process." Sutton studied him carefully. "You said earlier that I was only scratching the surface. What did you mean?" Orson leaned in slightly. "Whitaker was a pawn. Cahill Industries is bigger than him, bigger than me, and bigger than this airline. You embarrassed him, but you didn't cripple the machine." Sutton's stomach tightened slightly. She knew this. She had known it the moment Whitaker mentioned Cahill wouldn't roll over. "I assume you have evidence?" she asked. Orson smiled faintly. "I assume you already know where to look." He tapped his temple. "Think Agent Gaines. Who was Whitaker talking to before the delay? Who authorized your reassignment? Who kept trying to push you off this flight?" Sutton didn't need to think long. Marcus, the flight attendant who had tried to remove her. He was still here, still watching. Her gaze flicked toward the galley. Marcus stood near the entrance to the cockpit, speaking in hushed tones with another crew member. As if sensing her eyes on him, he glanced over. Their gazes locked. He didn't smile. He didn't look nervous. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, before turning away. A message. A warning. Orson watched the exchange, then grabbed his carry-on. "Careful, Agent. This thing doesn't end when the flight does." Sutton flexed her fingers. "Good." Orson chuckled. "You really don't scare easy, do you?" She gave him a half-smile. "Not when I smell blood in the water." A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We have received clearance to depart shortly. Please remain seated as we prepare for takeoff." Sutton sat back, adjusting her seatbelt. This wasn't over. Whitaker had been easy. The real game was just beginning. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Sutton tapped out a single message on her phone. Cahill confirmed. "Need surveillance on Marcus Fielding. Possible link inside airline." Her phone buzzed a second later. "Understood. Stand by for further ops." She locked her screen and exhaled. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a fight. And she was just getting started. The end. If you enjoyed this intense showdown of justice versus corruption, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping stories. What was your favorite twist? Did you see Whitaker's downfall coming, or were you surprised by Orson's role? And what do you think happens next with Cahill Industries? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from.